August the 7th, 1942, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. As the first light of dawn spilled over the vast Pacific, 11,000 United States Marines surged ashore. It was the opening strike of Operation Watchtower, the first major Allied offensive against the Empire of Japan, and the beginning of a brutal, 6-month struggle that would forever alter the course of the Pacific War. But beyond the thunder of artillery, the clash of naval forces, and the suffocating combat in the island's jungles, a quieter, more subtle weapon emerged, one rooted not in steel nor in fire, but in the very architecture of human language itself. The challenge the Marines faced was immediate and deadly serious. In the tangled nightmare of Guadalcanal's jungles, visibility dropped to just a few feet. Japanese soldiers often slipped through the vegetation unseen, their uniforms sometimes scavenged from fallen Americans, their English surprisingly fluent. In the darkness, a single mistake at a checkpoint could cost lives. How could a sentry, frightened, exhausted, barely able to see, tell a fellow Marine from an infiltrator? The answer, as it turned out, would hinge upon the pronunciation of a single letter. Among those who came ashore that day was Master Technical Sergeant James W. Hurlbut, a combat correspondent with the United States Marine Corps Reserve. Months later, in an interview recorded on March 10, 1943, a document now preserved in naval archives, Hurlbut described a curious security measure that became standard practice throughout the campaign. His words stand today as one of the clearest first-hand accounts we possess of this extraordinary linguistic tactic. "We always had passwords including the letter L," Hurlbut explained. L was thought to be hard for the Japanese to pronounce, since there is no L in their vocabulary. This simple insight, born of necessity, reflected a remarkably sophisticated understanding of linguistic structure, and though the measure was ingenious, it was not infallible. Hurlbut noted that English-educated Japanese soldiers sometimes passed the test, revealing that while the tactic was effective, it was never foolproof. By 1600 hours, 4 p.m., August 8th, the Marines had secured the island's most critical asset, the nearly completed Japanese airfield. Originally known as Lunga Airfield, it was renamed Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton R. Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. 4 days later, the first PBY Catalina flying boat landed, and by August 20th, 31 aircraft of the Cactus Air Force arrived, transforming the strip into the beating heart of the entire campaign. Henderson Field became everything: lifeline, fortress, and symbol. The Japanese would fight relentlessly for 6 months to reclaim it. At night, the jungle came alive with whispers, movement, and shadows. Japanese infiltrators crawled through the dark, sometimes alone, sometimes in small groups, attempting to sabotage equipment, gather intelligence, or sow confusion. For the Marines defending those fragile perimeters, every sound mattered. They had seconds, perhaps less, to decide whether the figure emerging from the dark was friend or foe. Traditional forms of identification were useless. Documents could be stolen or forged. Uniforms could be stripped from the dead. Even speech could deceive, as many Japanese soldiers spoke English. The Marines needed something that could not be imitated, something buried deep in the unconscious mechanics of human speech. That something lay within the phonological structure of the Japanese language itself. To understand the brilliance of this, one must look at how Japanese and English differ at their most fundamental level: sound. Japanese possesses a single liquid consonant, represented in Hepburn romanization as R, yet pronounced differently from either the English R or L. Linguists classify it as an alveolar tap, a quick flick of the tongue against the ridge just behind the upper teeth. English, by contrast, separates R and L into two entirely distinct sounds. The English L, a lateral approximant, is formed by pressing the tongue firmly against the ridge while air flows around its sides. The English R, a postalveolar approximant, is produced with the tongue drawn back, not touching the roof of the mouth at all. To a native English ear, the difference is obvious. To a native Japanese speaker, who grew up in a language that treats both sounds as one, it is nearly invisible. This isn't a matter of physical limitation. A Japanese speaker can produce both sounds. The barrier is perceptual. It lies in how the brain, shaped by early childhood, categorizes what it hears. Once those sound categories are fixed, they rarely change. Research conducted during and after the war confirmed this. Studies by Goto, 1971, Miyawaki and colleagues, 1975, and Takagi and Mann, 1995, all demonstrated that Japanese speakers continued to struggle with the RL distinction, even after years of English exposure. Takagi and Mann found that even Japanese residents who had lived in the United States for over a decade still had significant difficulty distinguishing the two. Miyawaki's 1975 study revealed something even more telling. When the acoustic cues were stripped away, Japanese speakers could finally tell R and L apart, proving the problem was not in hearing, but in how the brain processed them as language. For the Marines, this quirk of phonetics became a weapon. A Japanese infiltrator might memorize vocabulary, even grammar. But under pressure, fatigued, nervous, afraid, his tongue would betray him. Passwords containing the letter L became standard issue. Challenge words packed with multiple L sounds, lull, yellow, or Lollapalooza, forced infiltrators to reveal themselves in an instant. When challenged, an American Marine would answer naturally, effortlessly, but a Japanese infiltrator, no matter how fluent, would unconsciously replace L with a sound closer to R, a giveaway even in the dark. One specific word, Lollapalooza, entered the historical record. Journalist Oliver Garlin, writing for the Associated Press in his 1942 book, Free Men Are Fighting, The Story of World War II, recounted how Japanese soldiers sometimes posed as American or Filipino troops at night checkpoints. Sentries would use a shibboleth such as Lollapalooza, Garland wrote. If the first two syllables came back as Rora, the sentry would open fire without waiting for the rest. It was, linguistically speaking, the perfect test. 4 L sounds in rapid sequence, almost impossible for a Japanese speaker to pronounce correctly. And it made tactical sense. A sentry needed only to hear the first syllables to decide whether to fire. Still, Garland's account stands alone. No official Marine records confirm Lollapalooza specifically, though Hurlbut's testimony confirms the systematic use of L-based passwords. Whether that colorful word was truly used in the dark jungles of Guadalcanal remains plausible, but unproven. The Guadalcanal campaign would rage for 6 long months, from August 7, 1942 to February 9, 1943. Until the remaining Japanese forces were finally evacuated. Across that time, the Marines and, later, the Army units who relieved them faced an unrelenting enemy. Night after night, infiltrators crept toward the American lines. They wrapped themselves in jungle leaves, crawled on their bellies through the mud, and sometimes even spoke English to deceive the guards. Hurlbut himself recalled a chilling encounter. One infiltrator shouted, "Hold your fire. We are American Marines and wish to report our evening's activities." "I fired immediately," he said, "because I knew no Marine would talk like that." In those desperate nights, a single sound, a mispronounced letter, could mean life or death. It was language as a weapon, speech as survival, as air. And for the men holding the line at Guadalcanal, it worked. Eugene Sledge enlisted in the United States Marine Corps and was assigned to K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, 1st Marine Division. He would go on to fight in 2 of the most brutal engagements of the Pacific War, Peleliu and Okinawa. These were battles fought in searing heat and relentless rain, where the jungle itself seemed to consume the men who fought within it. His memoir, With the Old Breed at Peleliu and Okinawa, published in 1981, would later be hailed as one of the finest first-hand accounts ever written of infantry combat, raw, human, and unflinching in its honesty. Though Sledge did not take part in the Guadalcanal campaign itself, he arrived there in 1944 for training after the fighting had ceased. His writings make no mention of pronunciation testing. Instead, they capture the brutal realities of battle, the psychological toll of continuous combat, and the unrelenting endurance of the Marine infantrymen who fought across the Pacific. The absence of such details in most combat memoirs tells its own story. If pronunciation testing had been a widespread or elaborate practice, it would have appeared more often in these first-hand accounts. Its relative silence suggests that, while L-based passwords were indeed used, as confirmed by James Hurlbut, the practice may have been far more routine and limited than later retellings have suggested. In truth, effective security procedures often fade into the background, becoming unremarkable to those who use them every day. The Allied victory in the Pacific came at staggering cost. On Guadalcanal alone, American forces suffered roughly 7,100 killed and over 8,000 wounded. Japanese losses were far greater, around 31,000 dead, many succumbing not only to combat, but to starvation and disease as U.S. naval and air power cut off their supply lines. When Japan's high command ordered the evacuation in February 1943, roughly 10,000 troops were saved, redeployed later to other fronts. But the strategic outcome was unmistakable. Japan had lost the initiative in the Pacific and would never regain it. The limitations of pronunciation testing must also be acknowledged. As historian Herbert noted, the system sometimes failed with Japanese who had received English language education. A Japanese national who had spent their childhood in an English-speaking environment could easily pass an L-based password test. Japanese intelligence services understood this and occasionally deployed such bilingual individuals for infiltration or espionage. Furthermore, in the chaos of combat, under artillery fire, explosions, and shouting, detecting subtle pronunciation differences was neither easy nor reliable. False positives were another danger. American units included men from across the Pacific, Filipino scouts and soldiers, Chinese Americans, and others whose English bore unique regional inflections. Commanders needed to distinguish between legitimate variation and suspicious pronunciation. Linguistically, Filipino speakers of English rarely struggled with the L and R distinction, since both exist in Tagalog and other Philippine languages. Yet their cadence or vowel sounds might differ from American norms in other ways. Despite these challenges, the pronunciation test based on the English LE sound remained an ingenious solution to a very real wartime problem. It required no special equipment, could be performed in seconds, and exploited fundamental phonological differences that were deeply ingrained in early language learning. At its core, the test worked because it touched something profoundly human: the permanence of childhood language patterns. These phonological habits, set in the first years of life, are extraordinarily resistant to change, even after decades of exposure to new languages. For historians, the story of pronunciation testing opens a window into the small, practical innovations that shaped security operations during the Pacific War. For linguists, it demonstrates an early, real-world application of phonological science. And for the public, it remains a fascinating example of how language, the essence of human communication, could become a weapon of war. Yet the story also warns us about the dangers of embellishment. Some later accounts have exaggerated the scope of pronunciation testing, claiming it was a coordinated Pacific-wide system, or even inventing statistics absent from the historical record. The truth, supported by verified testimony, is narrower but no less remarkable. At Guadalcanal, American Marines systematically used passwords containing L as sounds to expose Japanese infiltrators who struggled to pronounce them. Combat correspondent James Hurlbut documented this practice, and one specific password, Lollapalooza, appears in a credible 1942 source. The evidence aligns perfectly with the known phonological differences between English and Japanese speech, offering a clear, historically grounded explanation. Beyond this core, however, there is no proof of broader, standardized testing across the Pacific. The embellishments, while dramatic, distort the record and obscure what is truly remarkable: the Marines' ingenuity under fire. Their adaptation to the dense jungles and the unseen enemy reflected not only courage, but intellect. Observation turned into survival. The Marines who pioneered pronunciation testing deserve recognition for their creativity in the face of constant danger. But this story, too, carries a deeper human dimension. Japanese-American linguists serving in the Pacific, many while their families were confined in internment camps, contributed enormously to the Allied war effort. Their loyalty and professionalism, shown in the harshest of circumstances, remain among the most poignant testaments of the Pacific Campaign. Ultimately, the verified record stands firm. Pronunciation-based passwords, incorporating the English L, were indeed used at Guadalcanal to detect infiltrators. The concept exploited authentic linguistic contrasts between Japanese and English, and it worked. Later campaigns, from Tarawa to Okinawa, would refine countless aspects of amphibious warfare, drawing lessons from Guadalcanal's early hard-won experience. While direct evidence of pronunciation testing in those later battles is scarce, the broader principle, using language as a security tool, endured. Scientific understanding of why it worked came only later, through post-war research into linguistics and cognitive psychology. Studies showed that early childhood shapes how the brain categorizes sounds, making native language pronunciation extraordinarily resistant to change, a finding that would explain why adult Japanese speakers struggled with the English L and R. What wartime Marines discovered by necessity, science later confirmed through experiment. The ethical implications of the method are also worth reflection. Unlike coercive interrogation or deception tactics, pronunciation testing was non-violent. It identified likely infiltrators through linguistic evidence, not through prejudice or assumption. Japanese-American Marines passed such tests easily, proving that language, not race, determined the results. This distinction between linguistic identity and ethnic identity carried profound implications for understanding human culture and wartime morality alike. The men of Guadalcanal faced extraordinary conditions: hunger, disease, and an enemy who attacked relentlessly, night after night. Yet amid that chaos, they devised practical solutions that saved lives. The L-sound password test may have been a small detail in the vast machinery of war, but it symbolized something greater: the human capacity for adaptation under pressure. By examining the evidence honestly, without exaggeration, without myth, we honor those who served. We recognize the Marines who innovated, the linguists who analyzed, and the soldiers on both sides who endured. The story of pronunciation testing at Guadalcanal stands as a testament not just to military ingenuity, but to the power of language itself. How a single sound could mean the difference between life and death, between friend and foe, between victory and defeat.